right, good morning again. So good to see everybody here, and being able to worship with you is always great, and we're so thankful for our team leading us in that direction. We are going to finish up this section of Genesis. How many of you have been here during any part of this series at all in Genesis? Okay, this origin series has been very good, very eye-opening, because we take a look at this ancient biblical text, but at the same time we realize how modern it can be and how much relevance it has for us in our modern times. And today we're going to finish up this section starting in chapter 21. We dipped into 21 a little bit last week, so if you want to get there, go ahead and get to Genesis 21, and we'll get in chapter 22. And we won't really spend much time in chapter 23, but that's kind of the end of the section. And if you're reading ahead or if you're reading into things, that's really where we're going to finish up this life of Abraham and how he factored into the beginnings of our world, of creation, of humanity, and what God's plan looked like through Abraham. Because God had a plan. He always had a plan, and he was going to go forward with that plan, but we get to see it and see a lot of Christ types in the life of Abraham, and we'll see some of that again today as well. Last week, let me just catch up real quick. If you weren't here last week, we did talk about how Abraham had this encounter with a guy named Abimelech. Abimelech was a guy who was somewhat of a foreign king to Abraham, and we saw in this encounter, like many of us, Abraham takes 2 steps forward throughout his whole life in faith and growing towards maturity, but then there's 1 step back, and this is, again, what happened with Abimelech. He is, in this situation, Abraham is living really in fear for his life. So he offers up his wife, because that's what we all do, right? No, we don't. But he's living in fear for his life. He's doubting God, and at the same time, he's spewing out these half-truths and displaying no faith at all. So we do find ourselves in those situations, whether we are offering up our wife as our sister or not. It doesn't much matter. We don't have to look like Abraham. We do this, though. But, and this is a big one, God is the God who intervenes. Doesn't matter how faithful we are, he proves again and again and again how faithful he is. And that's the greatness of God. And that's the God that we celebrate. And that's the God that we understand loves us, provides for us, is going to continue to keep his promise to us. And that's what will continue today. So Abraham is like us. He's on this journey of faith from immaturity to maturity. I don't know how many of you have reached that maturity thing yet or not, but if you have, let me know, and so we can talk and I can get some pointers from you, because it is a journey. And I'm going to guess, like me, many of you are not there yet, and you're just trying to figure out how to get there as well. But we're going to continue to see Abraham develop in this area of trust today. Now, little current event stuff that's going on. My wife and kids just got back with the youth group, with the church, or with Ridge Student Ministries, and I'm so excited to have them back. But I know whenever they're gone for a week, I can't help but to think about me doing trips like that for a long time. I did that for over 10 years of my life, and I love being able to do those youth ministry things. So I got to thinking about this and kind of connecting the dots with our topic today. When I was a youth minister, we did a lot of things, a lot of retreats, a lot of events where I would take kids to different spots that they'd never been before, and sometimes they had been before, so they were looking forward to going back to those things. One specific thing that we did a lot was these weekend retreats in the fall. I always did this fall retreat out at Sunset Bible Camp with our high school kids, and one of the things I really tried to do with that retreat specifically was some team building, some group building, some trust stuff, really, is what we try to do. So we would break the kids up into different things, different groups, and Sunset had this low ropes course is what it was, and we'd be able to have them traverse these different things. Anybody done low ropes course or high ropes course for that matter? You do these team building type things, and you see what they're made of, and you can see how they work with each other, and there is a lot of value getting a group of kids who don't live in the same house, may go to the same schools, but definitely come into the same church and fellowship and worship together. Like, how can we be a unit? How can we do that? And there was one specific thing that we did all the time, and that was the trust fall. Anybody done a trust fall before? No? Anybody want to do it right now? Okay, no? I love the trust fall because, truthfully, I remember doing this with our students because at the same time, I did this whenever I was back in college, and I was part of this admissions team at Ozark Christian College, and we did this team building stuff as well, and people ran us through these same type of things. And I used to do this stuff, and I was like, oh, yeah, I like the trust fall. I always liked it because what we do is there'd be this big platform, right? And you'd climb up to this platform, and your job was to, as a team, you were going to catch this person that was going to blindly just fall back and fall into your arms. And like, that sounds insane, right? Because you got a bunch of teenagers doing this stuff. Or 20-year-olds, in this case, whenever I was there. And so you, like, put your arms out there, somebody be on the other side, and they kind of cross arms. You just kind of be a zipper there. I loved being the catch guy. I loved doing it. I was like, yeah, come on down. Yeah, we got you. I promise we got you. It was my favorite thing to do. I loved it as a youth minister, doing that with our students. I loved being the catch guy. And I couldn't help but thinking about those type things, those type of activities, being that catch guy. You know what I didn't like doing? When it was my turn to be the fall guy. Anybody else? I mean, the catch guy is awesome. It's great. It's fun. It's like, oh, and you're giving each other high fives. And you're like, oh, we almost dropped you. No, we had you. Yeah, I love being the catch guy. But the fall guy, nobody wants to do that. Honestly, especially if you're anything more than, I mean, we would start with the simple thing of keep your feet together, and then one person would get behind and you'd fall, and you're just like, they're propping them. That catch guy is even more fun because you let them go even further. Really scare them a little bit. But the catch guy was great. But the fall guy, nobody wanted to do that. And here's where I want to connect the dots a little bit. There is going to be a time in your life and mine where God is going to ask you to be the fall guy. He's going to ask you to step up and to trust him because he's going to catch you. You know, a lot of times Abraham was walking through this process of faith and from immaturity to maturity. And you know what? God used him as the catch guy. A lot of times, you think about what he did with Lot multiple times. He was the guy that was going to catch. And God was going to use him and develop him into a leader. Like many of us may not trust in ourselves. Like this is what Abraham was becoming, is a leader amongst leaders. A leader amongst mankind that God has never placed that much trust in before. And that's what Abraham was becoming. But there's going to be moments where God's going to say, Abraham, I need you to get up and I just need you to fall. And I need you to trust me. So this chapter right here, Genesis 21 into chapter 22, this is when we start to see God call and challenge Abraham to be this fall guy. I need you to fall and I need you to trust. There's a beautiful, actually, it doesn't look too beautiful from the outside looking in if you've never read this story. If you've heard the story of Abraham and Isaac before, you understand it and you might get it. But if you've never heard it before, and if you're here, if this is you today, I hope that you see it with your eyes open and see that God wants to catch. He wants you to trust him. But there is this trustworthiness that we're seeing from Abraham that is being built to a place that maybe he's never been challenged before. So I want you to look into Genesis chapter 21. We're going to just kind of work our way through this topic, work our way through this little encounter here between God and Sarah and Abraham and Isaac eventually. We're going to work our way through this. And I just want to point out a few things as we do here of what the text is really trying to challenge us to be. Because my hope is you come in here, and it's not that my hope is that everybody's already a Christian. I know that some people are already there, and we're on the journey to, if you're not a Christian, I want you to see this, that some people in here, there are many people around you in here today that are, and they know some truths already. We just need to be reminded of those things. If you're not, I want you to hear these things for the first time. But here are some truths that we're going to learn. First off, look at verse 1. Genesis 21, verse 1, this is what is happening. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and mark this, it says it a couple times. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised, okay? As he had said, as he had promised. God is going to keep his promises. That's who he is. And again, there's some valuable truths that we need to If you're a follower, if you know the story, you need to remember these truths about God. One of these truths is this, is that God is faithful, okay? God is faithful. He said he was going to do it. He told her he was going to do it. He promised Abraham he was going to do it, and he did it, okay? The Lord visited Sarah as he said and as he had promised. So let's look and see how faithful he is to his word. Look at verse 2. It says, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Now, we need to understand. God comes to you and he lays out this promise. Or you see in Scripture that God promised this and whatever else it is that you are going to hold on to. We need to understand that at his time part is the most important part. Sometimes we want it in our time, but God is always on time. God is always on time. He's always faithful in his time. He's never early. He's never late. It was always meant to be there. For Abraham and Sarah, this is a 24-year journey. Remember that? 24 years before this, they were promised a child. 24 years before this, they were told, you will be a blessing to the whole world because through you will come a child that will be the blessing to all nations, that will provide all nations. This is what's going on, and God is making this covenant with Abraham. God never breaks a promise. And Abraham holds his end up of the promise as well. Look at verse 3. We're going to read this little section here. It says, Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah had bore him, Isaac. Okay, so there's a little bit of genealogy going on here. And Abraham circumcised his son when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. There is a little bit of the covenant that Abraham is holding up, okay? Remember a few chapters back, this was the challenge. First off, no male wants to be put in this situation to have this 90-plus-year-old man circumcising you. But this is what's happening, right? But he said from now on, whenever a child is born, 8 days old, you will circumcise. Remember the cut flesh, the dividing covenant. This is between God and man, sealed by blood. This is what's going on here. This is the covenant of circumcision. Abraham holds up his end of the deal as God commanded him. Verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now I want you to hear this language not as this isn't a condescending laugh. Oh, everybody's going to laugh at me because I'm some old mom. It's not like that. She's not going to the grocery store, to the market, and saying, look how old she is. That's not what's going on. What she's saying is this. There are tears and laughter, tears of laughter, tears of joy that's happening here. Everybody will laugh with me. Can you believe what God did? And there's kind of a laughter that's going on. I didn't believe it. Look what he did. This is the faithfulness that God is providing here is also providing a laughter. And sometimes we need that, right? You're going through the hard times, in their case, 24 years of waiting for a promise that was spoken to them. You're going through times right now where it's like, when is God going to show up? Where's he at? And sometimes you're like, I can't believe I doubted myself. And you just start laughing about the moment. That's what's going on here with Sarah and Abraham. And this is where Isaac comes in with this laughter. God brings a joyous laughter to a family that has grieved for years. Now, I'm not going to go sequentially through the text because some of this we revisited last week. There in the back half of 21. And there's some other things going on here we'll make note of here in just a second. But I want you to fast forward a little bit from this moment at the end of verse 7. Fast forward to chapter 22 because something's going on here that we need to just continue this story, this encounter here. 13 years from that point, this is what we see. And we continue to learn these valuable truths from God. Number one, we see right there, God is faithful. But at the same time, there's another truth we need to remember, that tests will come. Okay? In the midst of God's faithfulness, tests are going to come our way. In this specific case, we see it as a test because the Bible tells us it's a test. God is faithful, but tests do come. Look at verse 1 in chapter 22. It says, after all these things, because what had happened was this meeting between Abraham, Abimelech, and all this stuff, this kind of happened again. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now, there's a phrase here I want you to hold on to. We know this is a test. We know from this side, we're reading this, we see it as a test. We see it, we get it, but Abraham doesn't know this is a test. God doesn't show up and say, Abraham, I'm going to give you a test. Now, if he did that, then it would be like, okay, I'm on guard. I'm ready for this. It's kind of like a teacher saying, hey, be ready for your test. At the end of the week, it's coming. God didn't do that. God didn't say that to Abraham. He just asked him to do something. It was kind of like a pop quiz. There's nothing to study for. You just need to know that I need an answer from you now. And this is what's going on here. And he's saying, let's see if you can, let's see what you got here. He's going to find out what Abraham's priority list really looks like. This is 13 years later. So Abraham's 113 years old at this point. A lot of faith walking, a lot of faith steps that are taking place. Look at verse 2. Chapter 22, verse 2. He said, God said, take your son, your only son, hear that, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, if you've never read this before, and you're going through this story of patience, just like Abraham and Sarah are going through, you're thinking, what is going on with God? This seems morally questionable, honestly. Wait, you want me to kill my son? I thought you were a God of life. I thought you valued life. Remember back with Cain and Abel, and we talked about the value of life, the sanctity of life? Wait, God, I thought you valued life. It seems morally questionable. Now, we know this as a test. We've seen it from the other side of this. But this seems like God has just asked Abraham to kill his son. That's what it reads like, right? I mean, it seems inconsistent with God and his character. But the truth is, God is faithful. We've seen him faithful. Abraham has seen him as faithful. And because of that, Abraham going on 113 years now, there's a lot of faith steps that's going on. Many of those steps are walking with God. So Abraham knows that God is faithful. He knows this. And this is what it says in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. So Abraham hears this voice from God. Now, this happens over and over and over in Abraham's life. And he saw him in visions. He had seen God in dreams. He had heard his audible voice. This is showing up again. He hears the voice of God. He knows the voice of God. When you walk with Jesus for a long, long time, you know the voice of Jesus. When you are a sheep and you're walking with the same shepherd forever, you know the voice of the shepherd. Jesus talks a little bit about that in his parables, right? This is exactly what we can see with Abraham and his relationship with God. There's a knowledge that people who don't have that relationship with God may not understand, but Abraham knows, and he understands, and he hears the voice of God. This whole thing just kind of feels crazy. It feels wrong. But they've been through this covenant together. Look at verse 5. It said, then Abraham says to his young men, remember there were 2 young men with him, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and will come again to you. Okay, do you catch what's going on here? It says, I and the boy will go over there and worship, and will come again to you. He didn't say, I'll come back to you, but Isaac's not coming back. He has faith in this moment. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they both went, both of them went together. Now, in my mind, I'm just trying to set up like this skips so fast in the book. When you're reading Genesis 22 here, you're like, wait, slow down here. This doesn't seem right. Why is this going so quick? What did this scene look like? If this was a scene on television or on the movies, what would this look like? Is there a fight? How does a 113-year-old man even chase a 13-year-old boy in the first place? I don't know. How does he do this? Is there trust between Abraham and Isaac to where it's like, okay, hold my hand, son. And at that moment, does he just start wrangling him up? I don't know how this goes. But any father really ever want to do this? I mean, I don't want to chase my kid, let alone tie him down. And this is what God is asking Abraham to do with Isaac here. This is crazy. Verse 7 says, and Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Like, is he asking this while he's already tied up? I don't know how this is working. Maybe he's just a really, really naive kid. I don't know how this is going. But it's like, you're about to die, kid. If I'm one of these other two, and Abraham's told me to stay back, I'm probably running towards this scene, trying to fight and make this stop. But Abraham said, verse 8, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. This whole thing, to me, it just feels wrong, seems out of place. But throughout Genesis, what we've been saying is this: the beginnings here, Genesis origins, it's all a foreshadow of the end. And when I mean end, I mean the completion. The mission is done. This part of the beginnings is a foreshadowing of what we see whenever Jesus finishes it all. That, to me, this is the whole point of this text. We've been saying over and over and over again, and you know what? I can't even hide it. You probably see it, and you probably don't even need it preached to you. You've got to see the connection between Isaac and Jesus here. Your only son, whom you love. The language is almost identical to what we see in the New Testament. Jesus is the true and better. We've said this over and over and over again. Isaac is the only son of the Father. He's the only son. Isaac, if you look at this scene, Isaac is led up a hill with two other men. What do we see? Jesus going up to the hill, going up to the mount on Golgotha, flanked by two men. There's imagery here that you can't, it just burns in your brain. Isaac carries the wood to the sacrifice. Jesus carries the wood, the cross, to his own sacrifice. Over and over again, you see this rhyming going on. Abraham takes the knife. Now, you don't see this real clearly, but in Acts chapter 2, it says that Jesus was crucified by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. God has the knife. God is ready to sacrifice his own son, the Father with the knife. So how could, the question is, we see all this. We see it. Abraham doesn't see what's going to happen 4,000 years later. He doesn't see this. But we see it. So how could Abraham obey in the midst of a scenario like this? This kind of request by God. How does he obey? How would you obey? We're given a clue in Hebrews chapter 11 to kind of take a look back at this. This is what I love about the Bible. There's no accidents. There's all kinds of perfect imagery pointing forward. Hebrews actually looks back. Here's what it says in verse 17, Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Okay, so we see this. This was by faith. How does Abraham do it? By faith. How do we do anything? By faith. But I don't have financial security. Well, by faith, you make these decisions. How am I supposed to take in this extra child into my home? Well, by faith, you do this. How do I help the neighbor next door? By faith, you do it. What am I supposed to do here? Well, by faith. Here's the key for Abraham. Look at verse 19 in Hebrews 11. It says, he considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead. We don't get that picture there back in Genesis 22, do we? It doesn't say that. But in Hebrews 11 it says, Abraham considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So here's what we learn about Abraham. That I don't think we would have known if we just looked at this passage alone. But what we see from the writer of Hebrews, by faith, he knew that even God could have resurrected him from the dead. Abraham, this is way before the resurrection of Jesus, way before anybody who had been resurrected from the dead. By faith, he knew. Abraham had it within him. He served a God of resurrection. That's pretty cool. It's hard to imagine, hard to understand any of this stuff, but it's pretty phenomenal that he knew that he was worshiping a God of resurrection. This God of resurrection hope. That's what we put our hope in today. That's what we celebrate Easter with every year. Well, he didn't have that, right? He didn't have that. When we grieve By faith, we understand that they will be resurrected if they are living with Jesus. We will meet again. This test doesn't make sense, honestly, to Abraham at all. It doesn't make sense. But that's because Abraham doesn't know that it's a test. He doesn't know. Look at verse 9. It says, when they come to this place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, laid the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. Now, he's going to do this. You maybe you've even seen like paintings of this, right? I'm thinking there's no way. I'm crying during this moment if I'm having to do this. Even if I'm putting my full faith in God on this. Why, God, are you asking me to do this? If I have to, I will. But I'm probably not going to do this. I can't imagine it. None of us could probably imagine this. Abraham didn't just wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm going to be faithful to God in a big way. I'm going to do something. And today God spoke to me, and so I'm going to do this. I guess I'll just offer up my son. If this is what he's going to, you know what? This didn't happen overnight. We said this last week. You don't go from immaturity to maturity overnight. You don't go from faithless to faithful overnight. It is a process. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, and sometimes you've fallen back that step. 13 years pass. I know that there's even more that's built up here with Abraham. In chapter 12, we see these things where Abraham has said, or challenged, leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's household. Guess what? He leaves. That's one small step probably compared to this. But now in chapter 21, if you look back, and part of the stuff that we skipped over, there's more stuff where Abraham's being challenged. Hey, send Hagar and Ishmael. Send them away. It's going to cause strife between you and Sarah. Send them away. I'm going to provide for them. And he does. And he makes a big promise to Hagar as well. So don't think that I'm just skipping over this passage. It just doesn't have a lot to do with the Isaac thing. And even Abraham trusts in that way. That's a whole lot less faith than this situation, than being asked to kill your own son. But how do you do the big faithful things? You start with the small faithful things. You keep saying yes, you keep trusting, you keep understanding. For us, it's often going to sound a little bit different. For us, it's something like, yeah, God used me in a big way, but I'd rather only come to a worship service a couple times a month. Unfortunately, that's what it sounds like. That's what it looks like for some of us. For some of us, it sounds like, God, I really want to get deep in your word, but I don't want to really commit to a plan, to a time to do this, and to a quiet time. We have these things that are holding us back in so many different ways. God, help me to make more money. Help me to be this. Help me to be financially able to help the people around me. But I'm not going to start being generous until you do that. We kind of hold things back every once in a while. And I don't see that with Abraham here, because he said, God, what do you need? And he provides exactly what he asks. I mean, if you want to be faithful in the big ways, you got to be faithful in the little stuff, the daily things. So, important truths to remember. God is faithful. Tests will come. And then we're also going to see this. God provides. God provides. This is one of the big ones here. Look at verse 11 in chapter 22. Abraham's got his hand up with the knife. He's about to do this thing. It says, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Now, I don't know if you caught this or not, but 3 times you see this same phrase. From chapter 22, verse 1, a few verses later, it says the same thing. And now here in verse 11, he said, here I am. Here I am. Here I am. And I think it's pointing back to God every time. The I am. There's a connection between him and God. And he repeats this phrase. This covenant is intact. Verse 12, it says, he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your own son, or your son, your only son. There it is. There's that familiar language again. From me. Verse 13 says, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. That's what they called it. It's Jehovah Jireh is what it is. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. God has this track record of provision over and over and over again. God keeps his promises over and over again. And I wonder if while walking up that mountain, Abraham is questioning this. I wonder if he's going through this and said, okay, I know this is what I got to do, but he's thinking of the time that God rescued him and his family out of Egypt. God provides. I wonder if he's thinking of the time of his nephew Lot, whenever he got himself in some kind of trouble and he put himself in this situation, that God rescued him out of Sodom. God will provide. I wonder if he's thinking about the time where an actual child was born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman. God will provide. God is faithful. I think when God challenges you in the big things, we must not forget the other things that came before. And sometimes we want to erase those past provisions from God so that we don't have to deal with what he could possibly do in the future. God provides. You know, in theological doctrinal terms, this is called substitutionary atonement. He takes what was going to be the atonement and he replaces it with another. That's where the ram comes in to play here. There's a substitute for the sacrifice. In our case, the substitutionary atonement is, you know what? Because of our sin, we're supposed to pay. Sin equals death, right? We're supposed to pay for our own sin. The substitutionary atonement is Jesus. He is now not quite a ram. He is a lamb. He is the substitutionary atonement. He who knew no sin became sin for us. He was the true and the better lamb. He was a ram that was caught in the thicket of thorns. Think about that. Even that has some imagery. This perfect lamb in the thicket with the crown of thorns. I mean, it all kind of plays together. I don't think there's any accident here. This very mountain in the land of Moriah that was said was going to be this mountain of sacrifice. 2,000 years later, do you know what it was? 2,000 years later, King Solomon, built the temple up here, and there's all kinds of sacrifices that are now happening for the people of Israel. This is the Lord will provide. This is that kind of moment. It happens over and over again. 2,000 years after that, not very far, just a kind of a stone's throw away, there's another little mountain there called Golgotha. The Lord will provide this substitutionary atonement. This happens over and over and over again. None of this makes sense unless it points to Jesus. It is a scary passage. As a parent, it's really scary. But whenever you think about what you might be challenged to sacrifice, it's personal. A father waiting 24 years for a son, and then a deity asking him to sacrifice it. His one and only son, the son whom I love. There's times in your Christian walk where God is going to ask you to fall back. How is he asking you to do that today? Every single time it's going to point to someone being saved. Every single time it's going to point to this substitutionary atonement. Hey, you might be sacrificing something right now, but there's something bigger and better that's going to take your sacrifice away. It's going to be a sacrifice that I'm providing for you. It's a sacrifice that I'm providing for your family. It's a sacrifice that I'm providing for your friends. Anybody who you know that might be far from God, that is the true and better sacrifice that this is always pointing towards. But he's going to ask you, he's going to ask me to fall back. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for another encounter between you and Abraham that reminds us of your faithfulness. It's hard for us to really understand this. It's hard for us to even understand why you would do this. I think what we learn more than anything is that he's not asking, God, you're not asking for our child. You're not asking for our sacrifice. God, you're asking for our heart. You want all of us. You want every bit of us. So God, I ask you to bring to the forefront of all of our minds right now, what is it that you want from us? We know that it is everything. We have to decide what that is. We have to decide what we're going to lay down, what we're going to put on the altar. and what we know you will ultimately provide for in the end. We thank you for the provision of Jesus and the sacrifice that we have in him. It's in his name we pray.